Welcome back to another episode of the CSK8 podcast. My name is Jared O'Leary. In this episode, we're going to continue our third part of the discussion on modding practices and culture. So the first one, which was about a month ago that released, was kind of talking about an example of modding used in a formalized educational experience. Then 2 weeks ago, I released an episode that kind of talk about modding practices and the mod culture at large. And today, we're going to actually talk about some of the motivations behind people who engage in modding. Today's article is written by Sotamaa, which, again, apologies if I ever mess up any names. Kind of went with the Japanese pronunciation for the last name, but I don't think the first name aligns with Japanese. Anyways, so the paper that Sotamaa wrote is titled, "When the Game is Not Enough, Motivations and Practices Among Computer Game Modding Culture." And as always, a very friendly reminder that if you go to the show notes at jaredoleary.com or simply clicking on the link in the podcast description, you can click on the author's name and it'll take you to their Google Scholar profile, and you can click on the paper title and it'll take you to that publication. Okay, so let's begin by reading the abstract. Quote, "The actual meanings computer game modders attach to their actions and practices remain heavily under-researched. This article takes a look at the attitudes and everyday practices of the people who make game modifications, with special focus on the forms and consequences of collaboration between hobbyists. The case discussed in this article is the shooter game Operation Flashpoint and the modding scene around it. The article proposes that there is no such thing as an average computer game modder. It is suggested that the distinctions can be drawn based on the objective of projects, such as missions, add-ons, mods, modern motivations, such as playing, hacking, researching, self-expression, and cooperation, and notions on the ownership and potential commercialization of their work. Given the forecast concerning the growing significance of player-made content, this study can offer some down-to-earth findings from the long-established tradition of game modding." End quote. Now, the reason why I'm bringing up this particular study is because, yes, it is looking at people who are making mods for a game that is probably not school-appropriate, and is probably engaged with by people who are not in grades K through 8. However, by understanding the motivations for people who engage in this, it might have some implications for K-12 and CSK-8 educators who are interested in applying modding in your classes. If I were to summarize this particular study in one sentence, I would describe it as a case study that explores the attitudes, motivations, and practices of 29 people who create mods for the game Operation Flashpoint. Now, 2 weeks ago, I talked about different categories of mods, and some of those included software mods, while others included hardware mods. However, in this particular episode, it's going to specifically talk about modding video games. As I mentioned in the one-sentence summary, this is a case study, and it's a case study of 23 modders on a forum and 6 modders from a Finnish mod team, and their ages range from 15 through 40, with an average of 23 years old. And around half of the participants in this particular study were students. The way the author actually gathered the data from this was through the forum responses and posts, as well as emails and face-to-face interviews. The author describes some scholarship that says that there are kind of 3 motivations for modding PC games. One of them is that it's an artistic endeavor or a source of a creative outlet or expression. Another is that it helps people identify with the games and kind of increase their enjoyment when engaging with the game. And then the third example is that modding is seen as a way to get a job in the game industry, which I kind of talked about in the last Unpacking Scholarship episode 2 weeks ago. The author describes how many modders engage in small modifications initially when they're starting out, and then eventually grow into larger projects that often require entire teams with different expertise across the team, or asking for community support when they don't have expertise to complete a particular section of a mod. Now, when engaging in mod teams, there's often a project leader or leaders who find different experts across the modding community and bring them together for a particular project. However, these roles often shift because people have varying levels of expertise in different areas and contribute in multiple ways. In addition, they often find supplemental experts outside of a particular project by asking for community members to collaborate on a team when they need very specific assistance with something that the core team members cannot provide on their own. Now, what this indicates as a potential implication is that if you're going to engage in modding practices with kids, it might be very appropriate to bring together a large group of kids to work on a project. However, this can become a problem if you're working on a platform that doesn't allow different devices to simultaneously work on the same thing. So for example, if you're working on a Scratch project, at least at the moment, you can only work on it on one device. If you have two kids signed into the same account on two different devices, whoever saves last is basically going to rewrite over everything that was saved before it on the other computer. So what you would need is either people working on different portions of your project in something like Scratch on different accounts and in different project profiles, and then combining them all together into something, or you need some kind of a platform that would allow everybody to create something together all within the same interface. And this can become more difficult with the increase in size in your groups. If you're just doing 2 people or maybe even 3 people, you might have like a driver, a navigator, and some other form of role that kids can engage in. But if you've got like 5 or even 10 people all working on a project and only one person's controlling the mouse, it's going to be very difficult to keep everybody else engaged throughout the process. But what's nice is if you can find a way to have everybody take on a different role and focus on a different area of a mod, then you're going to encourage kids to kind of develop their own expertise that they can then use not only in this project, but in other projects that they work on. In Table 1 of this study, there are 5 key motivators for the modders who engaged in this particular study. So the 5 motivators are playing, hacking, researching, artistic expression, and cooperation. Now, under the playing category, some of the motivators were just simply playing the game or engaging with the game by adding your own ideas to it in a playful way. Under the hacking category is more of breaking down the game itself to try and figure out its inner components and how it works. Under the researching category, it could be something like under the other research I've read on mod culture, where people will engage in historical research in order to provide historically accurate information for a particular setting or mission in a mod that they're creating. For the artistic expression, it could be like I talked about last time, where it's a total conversion mod where you make it look completely different from the game was originally intended. This allows people to kind of add their own artistic expression to whatever game they are modding. And then under the cooperation motivator, some people were cited as saying that they really enjoyed working with other team members and kind of learning and sharing a common goal with them. So these 5 motivators for modding could apply into a K-12 classroom. So for example, under playing, maybe kids are motivated by playing games that they are creating, or by being playful with some of the ideas that they incorporate into a game. Maybe kids are motivated by hacking in terms of like better understanding the mechanics of, well, how do player controls work? Maybe kids are interested or motivated by doing some research behind a game and making it so that it's historically or culturally accurate. Or maybe kids are motivated by the artistic expression in that they want to go in and create some unique characters and change the artwork and things. Or maybe kids are just motivated by the different forms of cooperation that go on in the game itself. So if you were to kind of engage in a modding practice with kids, you could assign each of these different roles with kids. Like, okay, you're going to be the playtester, you're going to be the person who's doing the hacking or doing the inner mechanics of the game itself. You might be the researcher and you might be the artist. And then you could have them all kind of switch between these different roles, or just have them stick with something throughout. Now, one thing that I will mention, if you are going to do something like this, you're going to want to make sure that everybody at least understands how to do the other components. In particular, if you're doing a computer science class, you'll want them to understand the coding side of things. So if you're ever doing any kind of paired programming or driver and navigator, if somebody is more comfortable doing the artistic expression side of things and less comfortable doing the coding side of things, you want to make sure they at least understand what is going on with the coding and they're not just creating art, which obviously is very valuable in and of itself, but if you're trying to align to standards, they need to at least understand the computer science standards. Now, an important thing to note is that one of the participants actually mentioned that time spent in the game shifted towards testing the mods rather than playing it in a normal sense. So for the playing side of things, you're not just sitting there and playing a video game all day just for the sake of playing. You're actually doing it to try and make sure that your changes don't break the game in ways that you don't intend it to, at least. So as much as I encourage kids to work on games and to test their games, I also wanted to make sure that they weren't just sitting there all class just playing their games, but we're actually going back and forth between the code and playtesting. And by the way, a great way that you can incorporate playtesting is like at the end of class, You could have kids switch computers and test out each other's games or where they're at in development and kind of provide some feedback to be like, hey, I really liked what you did on level 1, but what I'm wondering is if on level 2 you could do X, Y, and Z. And then the next day they can come back and work on that. On the researching side of things, the author points out that some modders actually consult experts in the field. So for example, this was a first-person shooter, so it was probably a game that is not appropriate for your school. But in the modding of this, the researchers would go and consult military experts and look through libraries and go to museums to kind of make sure that their mods were accurate representations of what they were trying to include in the game. So although modding is playing with video games, you can actually incorporate a lot of research related to all sorts of other subject areas within the game itself to make sure that it's accurate in some way. Now, on the cooperation and community side of things, one of the things that I love about mod culture is a lot of the modders actually create tutorials or descriptions that kind of describe how to do things in modding. So for example, when I was learning how to mod the game Minecraft, I had never worked with Java before. I had never worked with Eclipse, which was the IDE that I was using, and I had never modded a game before. So I actually watched a kid go through tutorials that he had created on YouTube that walk through how to do it, and I was learning from him along the way. So this presents an interesting way that you could actually augment the classes that you facilitate. Rather than yourself creating resources on how to do something, you could actually ask kids to create resources that teach others how to do similar things if they are going to create a similar mod. Now, this might be very difficult to do for the first year because you're going to have to either create or find those resources. However, after several years of having kids kind of create tutorials and little examples and resources on how to do things, you're going to make it much easier for them to learn from others who have taken the class before them. So 2 weeks ago when I talked about encouraging kids to engage with mod culture outside of schools, what I was just describing is something that you could do to create an asynchronous community of modders in your classes who are kind of learning from people who have been in the class before them. And 2 weeks ago I talked about the notion of playbor, which is the idea of play as labor, so people who engage in modding practices are doing so in ways that corporations benefit from. However, the modders in this study indicated that they were actually proud of the fact that they weren't making money off of their endeavors. But what's interesting is they also note that because they weren't making money off of this, it was actually preventing them from doing larger and more ambitious projects that they wanted to do, but they didn't have the time or money to do so. So if you're interested in engaging in modding in your class, I hope these last couple Unpacking Scholarship episodes have been useful for you. And in particular, you could use this as an example for kids who are unsure why they need to learn computer science if they don't plan on getting a career in computer science. You could use this as an example and say, well, look, if you enjoy playing video games, then you could actually kind of create your own or modify them to do new and interesting things that you want the game to do that they can't originally do. Now, reading through this, one of the questions that I have as just kind of a lingering question is, in what ways might the motivators for engaging in modding practices outside of school be similar or different from motivators within a formalized educational context? So in other words, so we have these ideas that modders outside of school are motivated by playing, hacking, researching, artistic expression, and cooperation, but do those motivators change in educational context if they're engaging in modding? And if so, why? So for example, maybe a motivator is just getting a good grade. Well, why is it that in an educational context, that's a motivator, but it's not outside of a classroom setting? Another lingering question that I have is, how might these motivators change among different age groups, platforms or languages, or even types of mods? So among the age groups, we might ask, well, what is it that a 5-year-old really likes about modding, and how does that compare to a 17-year-old who's engaging in modding? Under the platforms and languages, we could ask, well, what do people like about modding something in Sonic Pi, which allows you to create live or composed music? And how does that kind of differ from somebody who's engaging with Scratch, which allows you to make like stories and media arts and games? And in terms of types of mods, I wonder what the motivating factors are for people who are modding games, and in particular are modding just the code or modding just the art and the sound of the game, or who are engaging in a total conversion mod. So each of these different types of mods might have different motivators for it, and I think we need to have more research on that. And in particular, not just research on informal settings, but research in the K-12 realm as well. I hope by listening to the last couple Unpacking Scholarship episodes, you've at least considered possibly engaging in mod practices in your classes. And just as a friendly reminder, in the episode 2 weeks ago that was released, I talk about how this is not just software modifications. You can also engage in hardware modifications, so you can engage in standards outside of the algorithms and programming standards, if you're interested in doing so. As always, you can find these show notes at jaredoleary.com, and you can click on the author's name to read more of their scholarship, and click on the title to get access to the publication itself. If you really enjoyed this episode, I hope you consider sharing it with somebody else, and joining again next week when I interview somebody else. And 2 weeks from now, I'm actually going to start exploring another topic where we're going to talk about questioning techniques that can be used in computer science, and that's going to segue into a discussion on some maker practices that could be used in computer science education. Thank you again so much for listening. I will talk to you again later.